Y'all know who I am. I'm with the Sons of Confederate Veterans. I'm the commander of 1613 Camp here at Johnston in San Angelo. I'm also the 2nd Brigade Commander for West Texas. I've got been knowing our speaker for 5 or 6 years now, I believe. Harold, is that correct? And he is a very good speaker, very good historian. I use him a lot, I talk to him a lot, and he's become good friends, I think. He hadn't thrown nothing at me yet. Give you a little background on Harold. Okay, they just tell him I need to scream. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Our speaker today is going to be Harold Johnston. He graduated Angelo Central High in 1970. Right after that, he joined the United States Army. Air Force, excuse me, Air Force. It's okay. It's okay. He went off to Vietnam. After his tours in Vietnam, he come back here, went back to college, graduated Angelo State University with a bachelor's degree in history. You hear me? No. No? Okay. I guess I'm going to start. His interest during that time, he was, from what I understand, coming across several accountings of the Battle of Dove Creek. And over the last 20, 25 years, he has been compiling true, accountable information on this battle. And today he's here to explain this in his research and his interpretation on how this battle went down. It's really neat. So at this time, I'm going to turn the floor over to Mr. Harold Johnston. Thank you, sir.
Thank you for all of you who came. Thank Old Concho, thank the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and everybody who helped put this together. Thank you very much. Before I proceed with telling you what knowledge I've acquired about this battle, I just was introduced to a gentleman that I want him to stand up. You, sir. This man who I just met, his ancestor was a lieutenant in this battle and was mortally wounded. And I just told him where he's buried. So so he'll be able to see
my great-great-grandfather.
Still has the same last name. And I'm going to talk a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about him as we get mainly into the battle. But where I first became interested in the Battle of Dove Creek was I had already finished high school, gone to the military, came back, and started going to school. I wasn't really sure what I wanted to major in, but I knew that I liked history. So I thought, well, I'll major in history. Well, I have this book. I don't have hardly any of my college books anymore, but I actually have this one. And I looked on the front cover of this book, and I took this class in the fall of 1977, and I was a sophomore, I believe. So when I got to the end of the book, or not to the end, but near the end of the Civil War, this is a history of Texas. Texas history. And as I got to the end of the Civil War, here I had grown up in San Angelo in Tom Green County, and I had never heard of this. And I read this paragraph, and it said, a raid into Young County in October 1864 by Comanche and Kiowa Indians was very destructive. People in the frontier communities moved into stockades for protection. Fording up, they called it. Ironically, the bloodiest battle with the Red Men during the Civil War resulted from an attack on an inoffensive party of approximately 1,400 Kickapoo from Indian Territory who were traveling migration from Indian Territory to Mexico. In January 1865, at the Indian camp on Dove Creek, a tributary of the South Concho River, 370 troops were repulsed with heavy loss. During the last 2 years of the war, deserters added to the threat of hostile Indians by creating confusion on the frontier. That is the first time in my life that was 2 sentences on Duff Creek. And I grew up here, and I thought, well, that's kind of, I mean, why didn't I know that? Why didn't I know anything about that? Well, in those years since then, I began to try to accumulate information on the battle. And if you read most modern accounts of the battle, they tend to be just what you got right there. These Texans went out there and attacked these friendly Kickapoo Indians, and they got a bunch of people killed. And that's pretty much the end of the story. But is that really the story? And is that really what happened? And what I really want to try to do today, most of these really quick accounts of the battle or a page of the battle, they don't tell you what led to that battle even happening in the very first place. What was happening in Texas. So, having said that, I want to try to, if it's entirely possible, in your mind, to go back to the Civil War in Texas and think about what it was like to live here, and especially live on the frontier in Texas. When the war between the states broke out and the federal troops all withdrew that were manning these forts to protect the settlements, there were a few rangers, but not very many. So what happened immediately when those troops began to withdraw, a lot of these very hostile tribes, mainly Comanches and Kiowas and some other tribes, began to raid even heavier in Texas. And actually our frontier, if you think in today's terms of what was the frontier in Texas in 1861, it'd be roughly from Dallas-Fort Worth down to Austin and San Antonio, and everything west of that on I-35, just nearly, was the frontier. So that frontier that did push a little further in, that frontier where we had began when that war broke out, that frontier retreated 100 miles backward. Why was that happening? Indian attacks. Common all the time. From the year of from 1863 until the fall of 64, on the Texas frontier, over 75 settlers were killed in that time period and dozens taken away as captives. And at the very end of that year, in October 64, there was a great raid that happened by Comanches and Kiowas. Minimum estimates, 200 or 300 warriors. Other estimates, 700 warriors. Came down on the North Texas settlements, raided, pillaged, killed, took horses, stopped, and by the time the Texans found out, they did wind up, they killed 5 rangers in North Texas during that raid. So this is what proceeds leading us to this. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is these tribes that they came into direct confrontation with in the battle. There were really 2 tribes out there. Most history books will tell you that those were Kickapoos. There were a mixing of tribes out there. There were Kickapoos, but there was traveling with them and had been with them for some time, was another group of Indians which were called Potawatomis. Now, where did the Kickapoos and the Potawatomis come from? Originally, both those tribes, the Kickapoos, were up in the Michigan area, and the Potawatomis were in Wisconsin. But there were some Kickapoos that were also in Wisconsin. They were both Algonquian people. They had a common language and a common ancient background. So their cultures weren't very far apart in their language. They could communicate with each other. Both the Kickapoos and the Potawatomis were involved in the French and Indian Wars, and they sided with the French against the British and the colonials. Both tribes, the Kickapoos So, and then another war came along, the War of 1812, and they sided with the British, both tribes, against them here. So they didn't, and mainly they didn't want intrusions onto their land, which we can all understand that. But the intrusion was happening and it couldn't be stopped. Those tribes eventually were pushed down into like Illinois, Indiana, Missouri, and by the time, just shortly before the Civil War, they had reservations in what's called Indian Territory, which is Oklahoma and parts of Kansas. Now, what some people don't know, Texas had 2 reservations on the Brazos River. One of those reservations was Pentateuch Comanches, and because of the Pentateuchs, my mouse the Pentateuchs had been very weakened mainly by like smallpox and white man's disease, had probably wiped out over half the tribe. They were fairly destitute and they came into the reservation. None of the other Comanches despised them for doing it. They literally wouldn't have anything to do with them. Well, there's also, that I found back to the Republic of Texas days, the Kickapoos had a small reservation in Texas. I didn't know that for a long time. They actually had been invited by the King of Spain before there was even Mexico had even achieved its independence. And they wanted them down here. First they were going to let them stay, and then the other thing they wanted them for was they wanted the Kickapoos to be a buffer against the Comanches. Because they knew the Kickapoos weren't afraid of Comanches and they fought them, which they did fairly often. Some of the raids into Texas may well have been, some of the tribes were really, even the people then, from what I've read in their description, the raids were so heavy, they couldn't necessarily tell you what tribe raided them. They just knew they were hostile Indians, and that's all they knew. I wanted to say, I didn't realize you had that. This is what's now Oklahoma, was nearly all Indian territory at the time. You got all these tribes separated. Most of the Kickapoos that are in this part of the country, by the beginning of the war, they're up right on the Kansas border, right inside Kansas. Now, the other thing I read, one thing when I was here at Fort Concho and I went to look in some of their research, I found one sentence that was written by Robert E. Lee, stuck in a back page, and it was on a single sheet of paper. And Robert E. Lee was with the 2nd U.S. Cavalry in Texas before the war broke out. He was here. He was originally stationed at Fort Mason, but he was on a lot of Indian expeditions up into what would be the Robert Lee area, and up at Camp Colorado and Camp Cooper. In his sentence, he said, "My greatest encounter with hostiles are Comanches, Kiowas, and Kickapoos," and that was one of the first times I had seen that. So there were already some raids that were going on down. He obviously knew who these were. Now, probably the initial big trouble with the Kickapoos had with Texas. When Texas was a republic, shortly after the Battle of San Jacinto, the Mexican government sent agents and spies into Texas to try to have some of the native tribes, including the Kickapoos and the Cherokees, to attack the white settlements. They thought that was a way of Mexico getting back what it had lost on the battlefield. We use these Indians. So there were some of these agents, spies, were captured, and the Texans formed a militia and attacked these guys, which were mainly Cherokees and some Kickapoos, and this drove them out of Texas. And this was like the late 1830s, 1838. So there's some animosity there already with these Kickapoos already, which don't ever get mentioned. They've been forced out of this state already. Now, the reservations I told you that existed in Texas, by 1859, Texas said no more reservations, go. And they took troops up there and basically escorted those Indians out of that reservation into Indian territory. So at that point, from 1859 on, there were not supposed to be any Indians that were hostile to the state that were in this state. They had been removed. And the life on the frontier had endangered so many lives. So these Indians were just pushed away because the havoc they were creating on the frontier was just something they couldn't deal with anymore. So it was like, we'll just get rid of them. If we can't kill them, we'll just push them out, which is what they did. So we really didn't have any. Now we have in Alabama, Coshada, and the Kickapoos do now have a reservation here, but in that day, those didn't exist. Now before I forget about these guys, I want to tell you about another group of Indians that was in this battle that probably very few of you know were even there. They were Tonkawas. And the Army called those guys Tonks. Who were the Tonks? The Tonks, if Texas owes a debt to any Indian tribe, it's them. Because they did nothing but help us and help us and help us. All the way from the days of the Republic, they helped every expedition of rangers that went anywhere. They didn't go anywhere without Tonkawa scouts. Because the Tonkawas could find the Indian camps that these guys couldn't find. Even their best scouts couldn't find what the I have read that a Tonkawa could ride at nearly a full gallop and follow a trail. That the average man would not see anything on the ground at all. But they would. So they were basically the eyes and ears of any expeditions. The Tonkawas were even, after this war, with Fort Concho being here, the expeditions that went north up into the panhandle of Texas against the Comanches and Kiowas, they always had Tonkawa scouts. The Tonkawas were going to take them to find these other tribes they were looking for, because the Army couldn't find them. So they'd been a big asset to us. Now, the Tonkawas, when these tribes got removed to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory in '59, the Tonkawas are in Indian. What's left of them, except for a few in Texas, very few. The vast majority of the tribe is in Indian Territory. The Confederate Army, when the Civil War first broke out, they occupied most of Indian Territory, Oklahoma. And most of the federal forces pulled back up into Kansas and stayed back there. Now, these Confederate agents were not only trying to enlist these Confederates, or these Indians as Confederates, they were doing this on both sides. I know that in Kansas, I have found they created 3 home guard regiments of Native Indians. And in the 2nd Home Guard Regiment, one company consists completely of Kickapoos. Okay. So some of their tribe had already been in the Federal Army, had received training, weapons, and had actually been in battle. In 1862, these tribes that had been forced north had a great resentment for the Tonkawas because they didn't go. They stayed. So in 1862, I want to try to find this. In 1862, 5 tribes from Kansas, which included the Kickapoo, and I believe some of them were Seminole, some were Delaware, and I can't think of, and maybe a few Cherokee. These guys come down, and all the Tonkawas were near something called Fort Cobb. There was an Indian agency there that at that time was being run by the Confederates. Well, the Confederates didn't have any troops there. They just had some civilian political officers, or probably maybe some Army officers that were working with the Indians.
Where's that at?
Fort Cobb, is that what you asked?
Yes.
It's being northern Oklahoma. Northern Oklahoma. Those tribes go down and attack this agency. They said they had a great despise for the Tonkawas because they had stayed with the South and stayed with the Texans, and they wouldn't sign it. The Texans tried to get them to join their side. We don't want anything to do with you all. So they attacked this agency. there were approximately 300 and probably 10 or 20 Tonkawa men, women, and children there. And when the attack was over, they had killed 167 men, women, and children. It was a massacre. The Tonkawa tribe, at that point, nearly completely disappeared off the face of the earth. There were just very few of them left. Texas took the remnants back to the state once that happened. It was too late to save the rest of them. But from that point on, they were, even with the things that had happened to them, they would always go and help when they were asked, will you scout for us? They did. They were the scouts in this battle. And there were 4 of them there, and when I get through telling the story, they'll be partly responsible for saving the guys that got out of their lives. And I'll tell you more about that later. Now, if you want to go ahead and show some pictures of some of what the Tonkawa did, I've got all 3 tribes. These are some pictures. That's actually a Tonkawa scout that was taken at Fort Concho on the right side there. So that's after the Civil War. These guys over here are Kickapoo, and these are probably taken maybe during or shortly after the Civil War, probably most of these pictures. You go ahead and show some. The thing about these are some Potawatomis. Now, when I told you these tribes came from the northern Great Lakes area, we would call those woodland Indians. They lived in wickiups or wigwams. They grew crops, and they were fairly sedentary people. But by the time these people come to the plains, guess what happens? Look at it. Does this look like a northern woodland Indian to you? They're wearing headdresses, wearing buckskins, they're hunting buffalo, and they're riding horses. They had become plains warriors. That's what you did out there. That's how you lived. As an Indian, Native American, on the plains, as a male, you had 2 functions. Make war on your enemies and hunt. And if you couldn't do those things, you were basically worthless to the tribe. That's what you were taught from the time you were a child, to ride a horse, to shoot a bow, to hunt, to make war. And what made you important in your community, your society, and your clan was your cue and your scouts you had on the enemy and how many ponies you had. That's what status was. It wasn't money. It was horses and coup or kills you did. A coup, an Indian counting coup on you, that means I could charge up on you, probably mounted, and touch you and never kill you. That's called counting coup. And that was a medal of honor. It was a great military feat to pull that off. But obviously, if he's shooting at you, you're probably not going to be able to do it. And I'm thinking probably not. You can show some more. Anyway, these guys both these tribes had already acclimated very quickly to being in Indian territory. I mean, they were on the plains now. They had to live that way. Did they forget how to farm? No. But this is what they were doing. Go ahead. This is where this old village that was located, if you're wondering where that was, this is the Clear Fork of the Brazos River. And over there is Caddos and Anadarko. There's some other tribes over there. But this is where there was an army patrol went through here in 1849 under the guy named Marcy, and he said that's exactly where the Kickapoos were, right there. So that's an old map. Were they in Texas before? Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Okay. Now, this is where they were about the time of the Civil War. I don't know if you can see this very well. This is Kansas. Right here, this little yellow dot is Kickapoo, Potawatomi. But the main point to that map is even as they relocate into the Indian territories and into Kansas, those 2 tribes are in close proximity to each other. Go ahead. These are just some other pictures. That's some of their mounted warriors on the right with rifles. There was some, I think, was probably some government agents over there. One of them looks like he's got a stripe on his pants, so he's probably military or military scout. The guy on the bottom right, that would be their typical wigwam type of structure that they were used to building in the woodlands, but they did use that down here as well. They would use sticks, take the sharp end, stick it in the ground, bend them over, run all the support around, and they would cover them with buffalo hide, which is not what they did up north. That's something they learned. But they also did, go ahead.
You want to go to the
Yeah.
TV one?
Yeah. This is a Potawatomi camp. Now that's a teepee. That's not a wigwam. So could they set up a teepee? Yeah. Matter of fact, when the Army first finds these guys, part of the reason they find them is the trail they're leaving behind, which includes tent poles. They're dragging them on the ground, so that's how they find this trail. Okay, this is just a picture probably from the French and Indian Wars to show you how peaceful these guys could always be. I mean, my point is, all you read and hear constantly is peaceful, peaceful, peaceful. Well, were they peaceful that day? They weren't always peaceful. Did they probably want to fight? Probably not. I don't think they did. But they got caught in the circumstances. We can change. I just wanted to say that these guys weren't all just farmers. This is Colonel Buck Berry, and we're going to start the story with him because he is kind of running the show behind the scenes. And somebody else will introduce right over here what we're talking about. James Buck Berry. Are you great-great-grandfather? Great-great-grandfather. Thank you. I mean, anybody that was. This guy was a character. I'm reading his book. Buck Berry, read it. He's a real character. And I tell you what, he's been in a lot of fights. He's very experienced on the frontier. By the time the war breaks out, and by the time Dove Creek breaks out, he's the lieutenant colonel of McCord's, the rest of the Confederate cavalry in Texas, in that part of Texas. And the Colonel McCord is away, so Lieutenant Colonel Berry is left in command. And all the soldiers don't call him Lieutenant Colonel, they just call him Colonel Berry. They don't call him Lieutenant Colonel. So, how this all now starts, Texas, with having this severe Indian problem, we've got most of our young men, in Texas, we're different than any state in the whole South during the Civil War. They're worried about fighting up north, but in Texas, we're not only sending troops to support the war east, we got a whole frontier to defend with very few men. Nearly all the young men have left. More young men joined the Confederate Army than the entire state voted for secession. Think about it. More young men went to fight in the war than the state voted for secession. So it was like a popular norm. I mean, it was kind of for the youth. It was the thing you didn't want to miss. So they all wanted to go to war. It was the big adventure, you know. So what you had left at home is mainly the younger and somewhat the older. And by the time this battle happens, Texas has a system of, I'm not sure I put that map in there, of their defense line of our.
No, that's towards the end.
Okay. Texas had a line of forts, or not really forts, they were camps. And they extended, and these had been there since the beginning of the war, but they'd been stripped of manpower several times. So by the time of Dove Creek, you've got a line of forts, they're camps, I say forts, they're camps. And they stretch from the river to the Rio Grande. And they're about a day's horse ride apart. And at each one of these camps is supposed to be what started out as Texas Rangers. They've been absorbed into the Confederacy because Texas can't hardly afford to pay them anymore. So they want the Confederate government to pay for them. So they reluctantly transfer these guys into the Confederate service, but they're supposed to be saying in the background, they're not leaving Texas. They're staying right here. You can't take these guys from them because Confederacy was like, no, we don't want to. we want those guys, if we want them, we want them back here in the east, in Virginia or wherever, Tennessee. They didn't really care that much about what we were dealing with out here with the Indian problem. They didn't see it, so they didn't have to deal with it. But anyway, they got these little camps, and these guys' job, every day, a patrol is to leave the camp and spend a day in the field, approximately about 30 men with an officer, and they would patrol between each camp all the way down the border. Now, and then the next day they would start back, and then they would rotate these. Now, these guys that are out here, that are the Confederates that are manning these, that are part of McCord, that Barry's in command of, what kind of support are they getting from anybody? Was not very much. You know, they were really fairly roughing it out there. I mean, you can imagine being on the frontier, away from a lot of things. You didn't have any conveniences. You're away from your family. You may or may not be getting paid. The food is probably not that good. It's a dangerous job you've got. It can go from total boredom one minute to you're in a fight of your life the next. So it took some pretty tough, brave people to do that. Now, to supplement that force, Texas had instituted a structure that they called the Frontier Militia, and some of the men refer to themselves as Minutemen. They are from the counties that face the frontier. All the counties that face the frontier, the Indian frontier in Texas, have been exempted from the Confederate draft. Now, that didn't mean people didn't go and volunteer, because they did, but they didn't have to go. But they had to be in the militia or in those Confederate units that were stationed out there. You had to be in the military one way or the other. So the militia's job, there were 1,400 militia. 400 approximately were supposed to be in the field at all the time, and each one of the counties provided their own militia. And they were to be ready at a moment's notice with their own horse, their own gun, to be able to call to defend their homes. Okay? So the militias, all within their county, elected captains to serve who would be their just whoever they decided that would be. There was a captain by the name of Guillotine who is out on one of these scouts, and he's about 30 miles out past where a lot of scouts are happening. And he's actually out near the location of Old Fort Phantom Hill, which would be kind of to the north and west of Abilene. And he's out in that area, and there's nothing out there. And he and his patrol find a trail. And it's a big trail. Now, what had been happening in Texas right before this? Yeah, it had a whole bunch of raids, and a whole lot of people have been killed. The whole frontier is on edge for another attack. Now, these guys find an Indian trail, and they begin to follow it. And it eventually takes them to a campsite. And they describe the campsite as full of markings that from where they have built these wickiups, some teepees, and there's a lot of them. And they're thinking this is a lot of Indians. So not only do they find that, they find things that are not commonly found on the Texas frontier. One of the things I took note of, that they discovered coffee grounds were all over the camp. And they said, we hadn't had coffee in Texas in 3 or 4 years. They hadn't had coffee since the war broke out. Wasn't any back to be had. But the Indians did. They had lots of coffee. They're finding their grounds all over the camp. Well, at this first campsite, they find a freshly covered grave. Well, I don't know if it was Guillotine, the captain there, or some of the other men. They said, let's open that grave and see if we can tell something from it. Well, it's a child. It's a young child. But they describe it's a female, and she's ornately dressed. And she has a cross on her chest. And she also is wearing calico, which they said calico was a rare commodity to be had in Texas at that time. So they're like, well, somebody important, but she had some beaded moccasins. Captain Gillantine took one of those moccasins and wrote a note. He sent a runner to the militia command, to Arras command, which were the militia, and then he sent another runner to McBurry, who's over at Fort Belknap, to say we found a big Indian trail out here, you know, need help, send help. So they followed the trail a bit longer, and they found another trail that's even bigger, and they said it's time for us to go back until we get some more help. I actually had a map that I left in the back of my truck that I wanted to show everybody. Could somebody open the back of my truck? I don't know why I got to talking and forgot this. This is what I want you to see this because it's in the bed of the truck. There's a big white, like a poster board. Bring it in. I forgot it because it was in the bed and I'm old. Sorry. But anyway, what I want to see, what's important when you see this map, I want to show you where all these militia guys are coming from and where they're going to. And the senior ranking militia officer is a guy by the name of Silas S. Toten, Captain Toten. And he's a captain just like all these other militia companies, but he's the ranking captain. So he becomes the commander of this militia that's being formed to go out and follow this trail. Now the Confederates, who are a different command, they're directly under Berry. He's got troops that are under a guy by the name of Fawcett, Henry Samuel Fawcett, who's also from Boston County. And Fawcett has got partials of about 4 to 6 companies that he's taken men from that Berry's released to go under his command. And they form a battalion. It's about 110 men of Confederates. These are regular Confederate soldiers. I'm out. This is a little do-it-yourself map I've made in Texas. Now, those green lines you see, and if you can see, the green indicates the counties. Those are the militia that are being assembled to go after this incursion into Texas. So it's like about 13 counties are providing troops here. Okay, some more than others, but that's how many. Now, all the militia winds up rendezvousing at a place called Camp Selman, which some people also call Camp McCord. It has 2 names because McCord was the commander, then they named it after him. Berry has told the Confederate captain, Fawcett, to go to Fort Chadbourn, and that's where his troops meet. All the Confederates come there, 110 men, and also he winds up getting 30 men from Brown County and 17, so actually wound up with 47 militia, one company of 30, another company of 17 militia get wind up. They're assigned to the Confederates, and they arrive at Fort Chadbourn to be with them. Toten was told by Colonel Berry had told these guys to rendezvous at Fort Chadbourn. Toten got all his men together, and according to their accounts, the officers conferred and said, we're going to go straight to the Indian Trail. To heck with Fort Chadbourn. So they didn't show up. And the Confederates are sitting at Fort Chadbourn all this is happening it's December of 1864 when this is all being put together, okay? And by Christmas Day, by Christmas, shortly after Christmas, the Confederates are at Fort Chadbourn. And they stay there for a while, and they're like, well, where's the militia? And they said, well, we don't have a lot of time. This trail's going to go cold. We need to get out and get after these guys. So they leave Fort Chadbourn while toting with all these militia. Now, how many militia does he have? He's probably in the very beginning of this, probably about 450. As they get closer to the battlefield, there's about 375, and by the time they go into battle, it's going to even be a lot less than that. So when you read accounts of this and they're telling you there was 500 Texans there weren't. A lot of the guys never even made it there. Their horses wore out, and they had to go back. And they had to weed them out. But anyway, these guys, the Confederates, they start out on the trail. If you leave Fort Chadron and you're from around here and you're going west, the next big land feature or something you're going to probably be familiar with is the Colorado River. So they run to the Colorado River, and guess what they find? A great big camp. And another one, just a short distance from that, lots of, where they camped here. Now we're this tribe of Kickapoos and Potawatomis, as they're traveling through Texas, they're basically trying to skirt the outside frontier settlements by. And if this patrol wouldn't have picked them up, they would have never even known they were there. Where they were following, if you knew did anybody know where the Butterfield Overland Stage Trail was? If you know where that was, that's generally the path these Indians are, where they're going. When you leave Fort Chadron and you get to the Colorado River, and you're going to go west, you have to go up a steep incline, which is pretty steep, and I've even read it in the accounts of the Butterfield stage that it was one of the most difficult parts of the trip was when they left Fort Chadron. The incline was so steep that it was hard to get up. Well, that leads over to the next valley down, which is the North Concho Valley. So these guys the Army guys are following this trail, it takes them up over that top of this plateau. They drop down and they come out on the North Concho River, and they find another great big camp. And this one's very fresh. Where would this be? It would be very, very close to Water Valley, Texas. And it was probably, one of the soldiers described that when they camped there, they camped 2 miles below where the Indian camp had been, and that was at Ranger Springs. And Ranger Springs is pretty much right down, central part of Water Valley. It's not a big town, it's kind of spread out. But the Rangers had used that as a camp, and there was also, the U.S. Army had established a camp there back in 1852 called Camp Johnston. And it was in that same area where this big camp is, and where Fawcett's guys wind up. Now when you get to this camp, they describe the Concho River as a beautifully flowing, quick flowing stream, had beavers and had flint rock all over it, and it was pecan trees and just beautiful. I mean, they said it's a beautiful place. But while they're camping there, they're still waiting on the militia to catch up. Like, where are those militia guys at? We need them. Where are they at? We don't know. The militia is behind them, but they're following the same trail, but they're probably at that point when the Confederates reached North Concho, the militia is probably no more than 20 to 30 miles at most distance from them. They're not that far away. Well, while the Confederates are there, one of the soldiers said, we discovered that they had marked a tree. And what he meant by that is they took an axe and cleared the bark off a tree. And he said, we decided that they had been doing target practice on that tree. It was full of holes. And they're like, what were they doing? They're target practice. These Indians got some pretty good arms. Okay, well, once these guys get here up on the North Concho River, they sit there a few days, and then finally, Captain Fawcett says, "We're going to send a scout. Let's go on and see follow that trail." So they send about, there's probably, I've read several accounts, but I know of at least 3. There may have been 4 scouts that were sent out. One of those scouts was a guy by the name of Lieutenant Mulkey, and he is he's a regular Confederate, and he has the unique thing about Lieutenant Mulkey. His mother is the sister of Chief John Bowles, or Chief John Ross, who is the head chief of the Cherokees. He's the nephew of the head of the Cherokee Nation, Ross. I'm trying to remember. I think it's John Ross is his name. So this guy's part Indian. He's half Indian already. So he's a pretty good scout. He's got another guy with him called Joe Byers, and one of the young soldiers who's in this fight. In his account, he described. It was great reading their stories because each one, as they tell you stories, some of their stories overlap, some of their stories don't fit, and other stories are like, boy, I never heard that one before. But it's like this guy saw something the other guy didn't see. They described Joe Byers. I love the description of him. He said he had a fine buckskin attired with beautiful beading on it. So he goes and they send another guy named Brooks that I know of. But at least they send these guys out looking for him. Now, when these guys go, as I'm reading their accounts, this is something a modern person wouldn't think about. The men who go out to try to find this camp of where these Indians are camped, none of them have a shod horse, and they're all wearing moccasins. Why would that be? Because they're going to move right up close to that camp as they can to spy on it. And if the Indians find their pony prints or their boot prints, their secret is up. Or they might even be captured. So that was the whole point to that. They were literally, and when I read that, I thought that would be something a modern man wouldn't even have thought of. But the guy back then, he would have thought of it. His life counted on it. He didn't want to be caught. So anyway, they get in and scout this camp. And they watch these Indians for a while, and they come back to Fawcett, to their captain on the North Concho, and they say, we found the camp. They're down in this deep ravine. Now, all through this expedition, I failed to mention to you the weather. The weather is cold. It's wintertime in Texas. And it had on and off, they had some terrible difficulty going in this weather. Well, this Indian camp is sitting down in this little ravine with a big hill near it and some other hills around it. They picked that camp I went there one time. And I'll tell you, when I walked into it, I thought, this is oasis. It's beautiful down there. This spring-fed creek is flowing through here. You've got big trees, there's game. You know, back then, there was probably even a lot more game, even more so. But it's a very beautiful area. So they picked this camp. Winter's coming on, and a big storm was coming, and they knew that. So they had pretty much settled in. They had all their encampment stretched 3/4 of a mile down the creek. There are estimates that village were maximum. There's probably 1,400 in there. Other estimates, 600 or 700. How many were there? We weren't there, so we don't know. Now, Fawcett, when he gets the information on this, Mulkey, Lieutenant Mulkey, who I told you was part Cherokee, he tells Fawcett, I believe those guys are hypocrites. And Fawcett tells him they're Indians and they're on the Texas frontier and they have no business here. And so we're going. So all these accounts that are read, I thought, how did this story get around that they didn't know who these guys were? Where did it come from? That's told over and over and over and over and over. He tells him in writing. I mean, it's verbal, and it's written down who these guys were. I don't think it really mattered to them, to be honest. And it's pretty much what Fawcett said. We're here to drive these off our frontier. So they'd come all this way. They weren't going to turn around after going all this distance they'd traveled. I mean, you got to imagine trying to get out to this part of the country with a lot of men and provisions in the dead of winter. And in that day and time when there wasn't a lot, I mean, it's just, a lot of them survived off just literally killing buffalo or deer or anything they could get because they didn't have a lot of food with them. Mouth is real dry. Now, once they've determined where this camp is, Fawcett, the captain, says we're gonna move in the morning, tonight as a matter of fact. It's January 7th. We're gonna move on that camp whether we have the militia or we don't. So on that day, they leave the North Concho on January 7th. The battle is on January 8th. So they've left the North Concho and they traveled with the Confederates, about 110 plus 39 militia. They wind up probably either on the Middle Concho or Spring Creek. Fawcett has them all dismount, check your weapons, check your horses, get everything ready for battle. All the men had to discharge their pieces. Why are they doing that? The Texas powder and caps are defective. They're in bad shape. Even before the campaign starts, one of the first things they had to do was the militia captain, Toten, had to go to Waco to get 6,000 caps for his men. The supply problem out on the frontier was, there were a lot of problems. That was another one. They had very defective powder. They weren't real confident in it at all times. So when he decides to launch this attack, he's telling his men, we're gonna attack this village at dawn. And what are we gonna go after first? If you attack an Plains Indian village, Randall McKenzie learned this after his first fight with Comanches, you better get their horses if you can get them. And they knew, the scouts had told them that they had a big horse herd. A big one. Well, we need to get those horses and we need to get them away from those Indians. We need to keep them dismounted to fight them. So their first task is to get that horse herd. They're not really, we'll worry about the village at some point. Well, in the meantime, the lead scouts of the militia catches up with these troops that evening before they're going to go into attack in the morning. And they're like, where have y'all been? And they're like, we're like 20 or 30 miles back. Matter of fact, the militia is at the camp on the North Concho that they've left. They've even left, and the reason they sent men forward, because Captain Fawcett's guys, by his order, had put in the trees notes telling them, if you show up, come this way, we need you, come fast. So they sent these guys out. Well, now, these guys they've already been in the saddle all day. All day, horses are running. Now they're capped in 10 minutes. Captain Toten says you got 10 minutes, load up and you're back in the saddle. They've ridden all day, now they're going to ride all night long. And it's at that point that Captain Toten, before they leave the North Concho, they've got a little pack train with them that's carrying some of their supplies. They're going to stay here. All the men whose horses are down, are shod, are lame, you're staying here. So out of this 400 and something man militia group, you got about probably 220 of those are now going to proceed on down to Duck Creek. So Toten with his command of militia, about 220 men. Now he's got, one thing Toten's got with him, he's got the Tonka scouts. And they take him down. And once they get down there and make a juncture together, These two guys, now Fawcett's idea, this attack is going to happen at daybreak on the 8th. At 8 o'clock, no militia. And at 9 o'clock, they begin to see them coming across the prairie. Here they come. So we're going to hold the attack. Here comes the militia. The militia basically pulls up right beside the Confederate cavalry and these guys, and they form Captain Toten and Captain Fawcett. They describe it as a brief discussion. They make a battle plan. This is the plan. The militia will attack across the creek, straight into the villages, and the vast majority of those men are going to be dismounted. They've got to dismount to cross the creek. Not only that, their horses are literally worn out. They're hardly not fit to ride anywhere. So they're going to have to dismount. Now, Fawcett, with his group, can we show a picture of some of the pictures of the battlefield? If we go back to the Texans later, these are just some pictures of. Okay, right here. Can you find? There's one from the archaeologist Larry Reinenschneider.
The one for
That one.
yeah.
This map was provided to me about 2 weeks ago. I had found out there had been an archaeological, some digs out there, and I thought, we better get some information from an archaeologist. Well, I called the Tom Green County Time. Okay, I might have to wrap this up real quick. What the archaeologist tells me, and the Indians even say that, this is Dove Creek, right through here, not the green line. This blue line is called Heber Creek. It flows into the Dove, right there. The Indians left an account of this fight, and they said our camp was located on two sides of a creek. So, that Indian camp, this is a big hill. There's a creek, there's an Indian camp here, and there's an even bigger Indian camp on the other side of that creek. The militiamen are going to attack. You can do the first Dove Creek. That's the last. Okay, that just shows the creek. We go to the second one. Okay, that one right there. This green is the militia. Here's the Indian camps in red. Their job is to go and hit these front on. Fawcett with his Confederates, they're going to drive straight for the horse herd and get those horses. And the horse herd, they've already located to the south and west of the camp. And they said they put the horses out every night and bring them in the morning. They take them out in the morning and bring them back at night. So the horses are all out. They attack this horse herd, they get it. I'm going to try to squeeze a lot of stuff in real fast. These guys hit this camp, the militia, most of them, virtually, I've not seen any of them that go into that village. The first group that goes in there, they got to cross the creek. They're scattered out. There's only about 3 entrances into the camp. This is dense thickets. Inside the camp, there are gullies in there that a man can stand up in. They're just like trenches. Okay? They hit this village, and the first thing they run into, several accounts say the Indians fire fast. I fired first, I don't believe that. Those guys went into that village, and they went right into the center of part of it, and most of the men had retreated into the gullies, and there were people screaming and yelling. And the first Indian that stepped out and offered to try to talk to them, they shot him, killed him immediately. Then supposedly a chief's daughter, who spoke English well, said, "I'll talk to them. They think we're Comanches. They won't kill a woman." And she came out, and they shot her, killed her too. And as soon as I can gather my best, when that happened, there are 400 to 600 warriors in that village, and guess what they're armed with? These. This is a British Enfield 5.77 caliber, the most modern firearm that existed. None of the Confederates had it. Nearly every Kickapoo and Potawatomi had one. Where did they get them? I guarantee where he got it. They got them from the federal government in Kansas. There was no other place to get them from. And then some of them were career impact. Anyways, this battle progresses. I wish I would have saved the battle to the end because it gets pretty wild. When these guys get in here and this first onslaught of musketry hits them, it devastates them. They just literally, a cloud of gun smoke pours out. And the guys who heard it was like deafening. And probably in that first volley, of the casualties of the militia, which were about 18 killed, I would venture to say the vast majority of them died in that very first volley. They were already in that camp. Fawcett not only secures his horse herd, he sends half of his command under Lieutenant Brooks on top of that hill, looking right down in that camp, and they actually see that first action open up. And their job is to attack that camp from the rear, and the rest of Fawcett's command is going to hit the camp from the south side. Well, when that militia takes this terrible onslaught of fire, a lot of the men panic, the officers are yelling, stop, stop, they begin to flee back, and as they break, matter of fact, one of the men's accounts is, we'd all fired our guns, and when Toten told us to reload and fall back, the Indians all knew exactly. A lot of them spoke English. They're like, they're empty. They're not loaded. And they said they charged right into them, and it was hand-to-hand combat. These guys were literally face-to-face, these guys are trying to get out, the Indians are trying to push them out, so it's just they literally chased them across the creek. They chased them literally off the field. According to Toten, he tried to rally them, the militia, several times, and said he did, but in most accounts they say he would fail to do that. He couldn't get them to stop and fight. They had no idea these guys had these weapons. They're also describing as they're getting hit from the front, from both flanks, that they're getting hit in the rear by these long-range rifles. But one of the guys in the Confederates later tells us, he said, thank God they overshot us a lot, or we'd have lost a lot more men. They literally were just getting peppered, but they were shooting over them quite a bit. Well, Brooks, who's up on top of the hill, he starts down the hill to the village. He gets halfway down, the militia's already been partly driven off, and guess what? The Indians see these guys. So they turn their attention on these 75 guys and open up on them. They got a horse hurdler on top of the hill. He's got 12 horses. They shoot every one of them dead. Brooks looks at this and he's like, we're dodging bullets. We're not going in that camp. There's no way. They're outnumbered. The offensive is done. He's trying to get his command off the top of that hill before they get slaughtered. And he gets those guys up there. They had to double mount men on mounted men who didn't have horses that were dead. They had to mount them to get out of there. He said he quickly reunites with Fawcett. Now, what has happened with Fawcett and the Confederates? He's actually hit this Indian camp on this south side. I've got like 3 or 4 accounts of this battle. I've seen 2 maps of this battle, and none of the maps show this. All the men who left an account of that position were Fawcett. He said, we were between, Dove Creek is on our left, and we had a stream on the right. That is right there. And they all describe it as a V. There's your V, there's the Indian camp. They had got through this part of the Indian camp, but they couldn't push through to the rest of it. Too many Indians, too many guns. And Fawcett's guys quickly learned, we got to back up a little bit. These guys got some powerful weapons. They describe, we knew anytime we discharged our weapons that our powder was so inferior, they could tell who was firing from the sound of their guns going on. The Confederate powder was very different. It wasn't as good as what these guys had. You go to right there. This is what happens. Fawcett is occupying this low ridge, and they all describe this. He's in the center. He's got Lieutenant Brooks, who is up on the hill. He's on the right flank on top of this creek, and he's got Lieutenant Gibbons is on the left flank over here. Why are they doing that? The Indians aren't stupid, and they're going down the creeks and coming up on their sides. And they quickly realize we got to cover our flanks. So he's got Giddens on one side, he's got Brooks on the other holding the flanks. These guys fight back and forth like this. I told you this battle probably started around 10 o'clock-ish. These guys are still at it in the afternoon. They're still fighting. The militia's long gone. These Confederates now are fighting the entire force. If the Indians had to fight both forces at one time, they would have been hard-pressed. But they only had to fight one at a time. And they gave them a big superiority. They already had superiority weapons, but they gave them a big superiority number. You're talking about approximately, 150 guys down here, and they're probably taking on about 400 to 600 warriors that are well armed. But they're firing at them from a distance. But at one point, they said there was 3 different attacks. They said, one guy describes it, and we played check all day. We tried to attack their village and get it, and they would push us out. And then they would try to come for the horses, and we would push them back. They're trying to still keep them from getting these horses. Now keep in mind, those Tonkawas I told you about, how are you going to pay those Tonkawas? All they wanted was horses. That's all they ever wanted. Those horses were a man's salary in a year. They got 700 to 1,000 horses out here. All the men in that campaign would have got one horse, would have paid. He would have been, that horse was valuable. So they want those horses. Not only did they want the Indians to get mounted, during the battle, they didn't get all the horses. The Indians had approximately 75 or 80 that were mounted through the whole battle. Well, this fight goes on all day, and at one point, the Indians hit Brooks with just about everything they got, and he literally begins to fall back and losing his position. That's the only time the Confederates, at that point, had begun to give ground. They had held a good skirmish line all day, fighting big numbers. They've been there all day fighting in the same spot. Well, late in the afternoon, when they hit this side, they collapse it. And Fawcett sees it immediately, and he takes men from the center and from the left and rushes them to the right. And they get there just in time to save that flank from collapsing. But they do it, and they hold that line. And that's at that point, Fawcett is like, we're not going to win this battle, but we got to figure a way to get out of here. So how are we going to get out of here? This was the plan. The horses are down here, and you got a lot of wounded men down here as well. That's where they're taking them to. The ones that are from the Confederate horses, they're back here behind that hill. They're going to bring those horses up to where they are, and then they're going to try to cross that river and get out of there. Why they chose that path, I wasn't there. I'm sure he had his reasons. But the archaeologist puts the horse path exactly the way it's shown. He said, yeah, they took those horses and crossed the Duck Creek with them. And that's where their demise came. The final demise for these Confederates. The plan is, you're going to take all your wounded guys that can ride and get them on a horse. You're going to take all your wounded that cannot ride and tie them to the saddle. They're going to pull Giddens around, who's going to be the rear guard, and they're going to try to occupy these Indians and slide while Toth and Fawcett and his mounted men are going to parallel Dove Creek in front of that village. They're going to screen the horses and the wounded to get them out of there. And when they started out, it was working just fine. Until they got to the junction and they had to cross that creek. And they said, the rear guard said, as soon as we saw the horses were reaching the junction, all the mounted cavalry, all the mounted Indians went to the junction, and all of a sudden the Indians that were in the rear disappeared. Where did they go? They were going up the channel. They were going to where those horses were fixing to cross that river. They weren't going to let those guys get out of there with those horses. And when they crossed that river, 0 minutes. I'll be done in 5. Can you stay? Can you stay? Am I keeping anybody from it? Okay. Should have saved the battle from here. Because it's left that long. But as they crossed that river, all the men who were there, they said that they were hit. He said, one of the men said, all hell broke loose. They hit us with everything they had, and the command collapsed. They turned into a frenzy.
It's like 3 in the afternoon.
Yeah, it's about 3 or 4 minutes. Actually, they said they began to withdraw, some accounts, 1 to 2 hours before the sun set. He wanted those horses out of there before dark. They didn't have a lot of time. So it's getting near the end of the evening. Well, as they begin to literally decimate them, the command falls apart. The Indians just rush on, and it turns into a rout. And they're really fleeing for their lives. They've lost their organization. They don't have a line. The Indians are pulling guys out of the saddles. They're just trying to get out of there. Not only did they lose all the horses, except about 75 the Tonkawas had already taken and left. They're gone. They're already left. So they get those. They get those 75. The rest of the horses, I've read stories that said they got away with the horses. That Fawcett, they didn't get away with those horses. They lost nearly all the horses that they went in there to get. So, as that line begins to fall, there's a great story in there. In this battle, 2 of the accounts that I hold are written by guys that are probably about my age now. They were 14 years old in that battle. 14 years old. Several 15-year-olds. Why are they there? Their dads are the captains. Or their fathers were privates or whatever. They all went. The young boys and the older men. So anyway, there's a young guy that gets wounded. And everybody else this is turning into a rout and a disaster. This guy's falling behind, and he describes in his account, he said, I'm lagging behind, and all he can think about is when the bullet's going to hit his brain. He said, that's what I'm thinking about. He said, I knew my life was over. I could see the Indians are right behind me. My horses give out. I'm in the rear. I'm being left as the other guys are pulling off. And he said there was an old sergeant named J.O. Alexander who yelled, here, boys, here. Let's save him. Let's save that boy. And he wheeled his horse, and a bunch of the guys wheeled with him. And he said they formed on a ridge, and he said they saved my life. And they made a stand. After total disorganization and they're falling apart, they make a stand, and they hold that ridge long enough to get all the wounded and everybody else out of there. But guess what? They couldn't hold that either. They said they were like a swarm of hornets on top of them. They said we couldn't move. They were hitting our flanks, hitting the front of us. But anyway, at this point, they just pull out and leave, and they get the Indians go back to their camp mysteriously. At that point, they back off on this last attack. So, another talk about the long retreat out of there. The long story, which is a wonderful story about the retreat out of there and how they survived that. It was just a total nightmare. But the guys that were in this, when they leave, they didn't realize that same night the Indians were thinking the same thing. These guys are going to come back. We're leaving. So they pack up in the middle of the night. Left, I've read one account, when they went back to that camp to get the dead, there was 500 to 1,000 buffalo robes. They said it was over 5 wagon loads of goods they took out of that camp. That's how fast those Indians went. They had a hard time getting into Mexico. Created bad blood for a long time. One other thing I want to, and then I'm going to wrap it up with this. There's a lot of little side stories that I read in these, but most of the accounts I read of the battle, nearly all the accounts said when we went back for the bodies, none were scalped, but most had been stripped of their clothing. But I read 2 accounts that said Joe Byron, who wore the fine buckskin, the scalp. Joe Byron was in the center of the camp. with his head on a pole. And his body was propped against a tree, headless, on top of the body of another dead soul. And I thought about that, and I thought, why did they do that to him when they didn't touch another man there? I'll leave that one for you to think about, but I have an opinion of what that may be.
It looks like the Indians would have had a pretty easy trail going east. That looks like plains there as opposed to the mountains back where the Confederates and the militia were trying to get away.
Correct. And that's the way they left. Where are they going? Mexico. I mean, once you come out of that little Dove Creek, it's just prairie out there, basically. So, yeah, you can ask any questions.
I know times you should record martial.
Yeah, there was an investigation by McAdoo into this affair, and they questioned, you know, the basic question is, did you have, gentlemen, both the captains, did you have a plan? I mean, it sounded like before you executed a plan, it wasn't this way or that, but basically they didn't do anything to those guys. They didn't do anything. And I think the reason they didn't, because they knew their orders were, there were no Indians friendly on our frontier. They were doing what they thought was their job. Now, did the Kickapoos deserve what happened to them? No, shouldn't have been in Texas. Shouldn't have been in Texas during a war. People are nervous, they're tense, people are dying. It's a bad time. You know, if they'd have made that move in '66, they just did it at the wrong time. But if my opinion, with the Kickapoos would have got to Mexico, would they have raided Texas? I have no doubt in my mind that's what they did. They raided and stole the horses. That's what they like to do. Yes. Somebody had a question or not? Yes.
You said that the captain where two rivers join, it goes on the mountain. Is that?
It's only stream out there.
Y'all have a approximation of where exactly, like Brook Park,
Where exactly? I'm sorry.
where two rivers join?
That's where they join. There's only two out there. The Indians left an account of this, and they said our camp was on the Dove Creek and it had a stream between with a big hill in the back. There's only one place out there that matches that, and that is this. This is a creek that flows into Dove Creek. It's the only one that has water in it to this day that flows in there. And that's a perfect V. It's everything they describe in the battle. Yes, sir. I couldn't hear you.
Where is the winter bottom range where the headwaters of Dove Creek is on that triangle?
Is the Winterbottom Ranch near Sherwood? Do you know that?
No, it's close to Sherwood.
Sherwood?
But it's at the headwater of Dove Creek where the water comes up on the spring, natural big spring.
That spring would be just back over in here.
Oh, really? Well, we was told that
It's not very far. The headwater spring is not very far off that map.
Is the Winterbottom the landowner on that side of town?
The current landowners, the archaeologist told me that he spent a lot of time out there because he said one family owns one side, one family owns the other side. That was a different account that I heard from somebody here locally. He told me that that land was owned by a company in New York. Now, when I went out there back in college, there were only a couple of pump jacks out there. But when I look on Google Earth, they're everywhere. They're everywhere.
I don't know if this is something that's named. Is Boy Scout camp named after Fossil?
I'm sorry, is what?
Boy Scout camp here named after Fossil.
Probably, if it's Fawcett, that's an uncommon name. That's an uncommon name.
Earlier you said when the Confederates were holding that line right
Yes,
there,
sir.
that the militia was gone.
They were gone.
Were they dead or did they leave?
They're dead on the field or gone. They left their dead where they lay. They were trying to save their own tail. They were the ones that got out of there. I mean, they just couldn't regroup. The Indians were on them so fast, it created a panic and a rout.
So did they retreat all the way back?
They retreated to Spring Creek. And that's where the Confederates met them. Yes, right. And I didn't have time, I'm sorry. But yeah, that's where the Confederates met the militia, was that night at Devon Springs. Yes, ma'am.
Just to clear any confusion about the geographic area, where exactly in Texas are we looking at?
Where you're looking at in Texas is southeastern Irion County, which used to be part of Tom Creek County, which used to be part of Bear County. But it's not, Sherwood would not be that far away.
This campaign, I appreciate there's always pop blue hearts that hosting us. Thank you, sir, for being forward. And the lovely Sarah Ross, we appreciate you wanting to see us. Also, if there's anybody interested here, that's got